remember that conversation very well. I wasn't even allowed to have that conversation with you personally, right?
Nobody in that room expected what happened next. Meghan said it, she did it, and by the time the evening was over, the people who witnessed it could not stop talking about what they had seen. The event nobody was supposed to talk about. There is a specific category of private gatherings at the uppermost tier of Los Angeles social life that operates under a set of rules. Rules that are entirely distinct from the ordinary conventions of celebrity events, charity galas, and the carefully publicized social appearances that fill the calendars of the famous and the powerful in that city. These gatherings do not appear on any public schedule. They are not preceded by press releases or documented by hired photographers whose images will later populate the social pages of glossy magazines. They exist in a deliberate space between the public and the private, attended by people whose influence is real enough that they do not need the validation of public documentation to confirm it, and whose social instincts are refined enough to understand that the most consequential conversations in any world happen in rooms where nobody is officially watching. The gathering that took place in the last week of February 2026 was that kind of event, and the fact that what happened inside it could not be contained within the social world that produced it tells you how extraordinary the evening turned out to be. The venue was a private residence in one of the elevated neighborhoods above the city, the kind of address that communicates its own social credentials without requiring any additional context. Large enough to host the assembled company with comfort and discretion. Private enough that the ordinary mechanisms of Los Angeles celebrity surveillance, the photographers at gates, the social media monitoring, the ecosystem of observers that tracks the movements of the famous through the city's public spaces, had no purchase on what was happening inside. The host, whose identity has been carefully withheld by every source that has spoken about the evening, was a figure of considerable standing in the intersection of entertainment, technology, and the kind of philanthropic influence that serious money buys in American cultural life. The kind of host whose invitation list is itself a form of social communication, a statement about who matters, who is trusted, and who has been deemed worthy of inclusion in a conversation that the outside world is not invited to join. The guest list assembled for that February evening reflected the particular world Meghan had been navigating since she and Harry settled into their California life after their departure from the royal family. It was not Hollywood in the broad, glittering sense that outsiders imagine when they picture the social landscape Meghan inhabits. It was something more selective, and in many ways more consequential than that. Media executives whose decisions shape the commercial and cultural landscape that any public figure with ambitions beyond simple celebrity must learn to navigate. Technology figures whose platforms and investments have redefined what influence means and how it is exercised in the modern world. A carefully chosen representation of the philanthropic and advocacy community whose endorsement carries weight in the specific areas where Meghan has been building her post-royal public identity. These were not people who needed Meghan. That is the detail that matters most when you are trying to understand the social dynamics of that room. They were people who had their own standing, their own influence, and their own well-developed opinions about who Meghan was, what she represented, and whether the version of herself she had been presenting to the world since leaving the royal family was a version they found credible, interesting, and worth their continued attention and association. She was not walking into a room of admirers. She was walking into a room of evaluators. People who would measure everything she said and did that evening against their own sophisticated understanding of the world she was claiming to occupy alongside them. What she did in that room, what she said and how she said it, and what it revealed about where she is in her own story at this particular moment was not what any of them had expected when the evening began. Several guests have described the moment it happened using variations of the same phrase, independently and without apparent coordination. They had not seen it coming, not from her, not that evening, not in that room. The woman they had watched manage her public image with such consistent and practiced precision for years had, in a single extraordinary moment, done something that none of her careful image management had prepared any of them for. What that something was, and why it landed with the force that it did in that specific room, among those specific people, is the detail that changes everything about how this evening is understood. Stay with us, because the room she walked into and the atmosphere she created, the moment she arrived, is where this story truly begins. the room she walked into, and the atmosphere she created. There is a particular kind of social pressure that operates in rooms where everyone present is powerful enough to be entirely comfortable and self-possessed, and where the usual tools of social navigation, charm, credentials, the implicit authority of a title or a famous name carry considerably less weight than they would in almost any other context. The pressure does not announce itself. It does not arrive in the form of a cold reception or visible hostility. It arrives in something subtler and, in many ways, more demanding than either of those. It arrives in the quality of attention that the room extends to a new arrival. Not warm, not cold, evaluative. The kind of attention that takes the full measure of a person in the first few minutes and forms conclusions that the remainder of the evening will either confirm or complicate. That was the attention Meghan received when she arrived at the February gathering. And sources who were present describe her navigation of those first minutes with a consistency that suggests they were watching the same thing from different angles. She was composed. She was warm in the specific, practiced way that people who have spent years performing warmth in high-stakes social environments learn to produce on demand. She moved through the initial greetings with the ease of someone who understood the social geography of the room and had prepared herself for exactly the kind of evaluative attention it was extending to her. But preparation and ease are not the same thing. And in a room full of people sophisticated enough to know the difference, the distinction was registered. To understand why, you have to understand the specific tensions that Meghan carried into that room that February evening. Tensions that had nothing to do with the British royal family in their immediate form and everything to do with the commercial and public identity she had been constructing in California since leaving it. The preceding months had not been straightforward for the Sussex brand. That phrase may sound reductive, but it describes something real and complex. Meghan and Harry have been managing a difficult intersection. It involves personal identity, commercial ambition, and public narrative. This balancing act began when they departed from royal life. Projects had been launched and received with mixed responses from the specific audiences whose enthusiasm Meghan needed most. The carefully cultivated image of a woman who had walked away from royal privilege to live authentically and purposefully on her own terms required constant maintenance in a media environment that had become, if anything, more rather than less skeptical about the authenticity of that narrative. And the people assembled in that Los Angeles residence on that February evening were precisely the people whose private assessment of that narrative's credibility mattered most to its continued commercial and cultural viability. Several guests have described the atmosphere of the first hour of the evening in terms that convey a social complexity that simple descriptions of a party cannot capture. Conversations were engaged and intelligent. The host had assembled people with genuine things to say to one another, and the evening had the quality of a gathering where the discussion itself was the point rather than the social performance surrounding it. Meghan participated. She was articulate, engaged, and demonstrated the cultural and intellectual fluency that has always been among her most genuine social assets. But there was something underneath the surface of that first hour that sources describe with a careful consistency, a quality of restraint in the room's response to her that went beyond ordinary social politeness. Questions were asked of her that, in their phrasing and specificity, were the kind of questions that sophisticated people ask when testing the consistency between a public narrative and a private reality. Not hostile questions, precise ones, the kind that reveals, in the answer they produce, whether the person responding is speaking from genuine conviction or from the practiced fluency of someone who has rehearsed their story so many times that the rehearsal has become indistinguishable from the truth. Meghan answered them, fluently, warmly, and with the kind of detail that suggested she had not simply rehearsed her narrative, but had genuinely inhabited it. And, for the first hour, the evening proceeded as such gatherings typically do when everyone present is skilled enough to maintain the social surface, regardless of what is happening beneath it. And then, something shifted. Not in the room's behavior toward Meghan, in Meghan's behavior toward the room. A moment arrived, sources say, preceded by a change in her demeanor so subtle that not everyone present registered it at the time, but those who did described it as the moment they understood the evening was about to become something different from what it had been. She set down her glass. She turned toward the larger group, and she began to speak in a register that was noticeably, unmistakably different from the one she had been using for the preceding hour. Less performed, less careful, more direct in a way that the room had not expected, and that immediately drew the attention of everyone within earshot. What came next is what nobody in that room had prepared themselves for. Stay with us, because what Meghan said in that moment is what makes this story truly extraordinary. What Meghan said that left the room speechless. Every source who was present at the February gathering in Los Angeles describes the same moment. This was true regardless of where they stood in the room. It did not matter how close they were to Meghan. It did not matter how they felt about her personally. They all noticed the same shift. The moment she stopped performing and started speaking. Not the words themselves, not initially, but the quality of the shift, the way the register of her voice changed. The way the careful, practiced warmth that had characterized the first hour of the evening gave way to something rawer and more unguarded than anyone in that room had ever witnessed from her in any context, public or private. Several guests have described it as the sensation of watching someone remove a mask they had been wearing for so long that the act of removal felt almost violent in its abruptness. She began by addressing something that a guest had raised in conversation approximately 20 minutes earlier. A question about the Sussex Foundation's direction, phrased with the particular precision of someone genuinely curious but not entirely without an edge. Meghan had answered it in the first instance with the fluency that the room had come to expect from her across the preceding hour, but she had not, sources say, finished with it. And when she returned to it, setting down her glass and turning toward the wider group, it became clear immediately that what she was about to say was not a continuation of the earlier answer. It was a correction. She said the version of her story the public had been given was incomplete, not a lie. She was careful about that distinction, careful in a way that suggested the distinction mattered to her personally rather than simply strategically. But incomplete in ways that she had made a decision. She said, some time ago, that she was no longer willing to maintain in rooms where the incompleteness served nobody and cost her more than the protection it offered. The room went very quiet. What followed was approximately 12 minutes of disclosure that sources describe with the consistency of people who lived through something genuinely unexpected and are still processing its full implications. Meghan spoke about the period immediately preceding her and Harry's decision to step back from royal duties. Not the public version of that period, the one documented in interviews, the Netflix series, the memoir that Harry had published, the private version, the version that existed in the gap between what had been said publicly and what had actually been experienced privately. She was specific in a way that the public accounts had never been. Not about individuals, at least not initially, about situations. About specific moments and specific decisions and specific conversations that had taken place inside the royal household during those final months that had never been accurately represented in any account she or Harry had given, publicly. She described a level of institutional isolation that went considerably beyond what the couple's public statements had conveyed. Decisions made about their security, their funding, their public role, and their private access to family support that she characterized not as the product of misunderstanding or communication failure, the framing that the more charitable public interpretations of the Sussex departure had always fallen back on, but as deliberate, coordinated, and originating from a specific point of institutional authority whose identity she did not name, but whose description left very little room for ambiguity in a room full of people who followed the internal dynamics of the British royal family with the informed attention of individuals who understood that those dynamics had real consequences in the world they all operated in. And then she said the thing that nobody expected, the thing that changed the temperature of the room in a way that sources struggle to describe without reaching for the same words. She named a specific decision. One decision, made at a specific moment by a specific institutional process, that she said had been the point at which she understood that the situation she was in was not one that goodwill, patience, or any form of private negotiation was going to resolve. A decision whose nature she described with enough specificity that several guests, according to sources, exchanged glances in the moment of hearing it. The kind of glance that passes between people who have just heard something that confirms a suspicion they had held privately but never expected to hear confirmed publicly. She did not qualify for it. She did not soften it with the careful diplomatic language that has characterized every previous public statement she has made about her time inside the royal family. She said it plainly, directly, and with the particular finality of someone who has made a decision about what they are no longer willing to carry alone. The room stayed quiet for a moment, which sources describe as lasting considerably longer than it probably did in clock time, and then everyone began talking at once. Stay with us, because the reaction inside that room and the calls that started before the night was over are where this story takes its next extraordinary turn. The reaction inside the room. Understand something fundamental about the specific social world that was assembled in that Los Angeles residence on that February evening. These were not people who lost their composure easily. They were not people who had arrived at their respective positions in American cultural, commercial, and technological life by being easily rattled or publicly expressive about their private reactions to unexpected information. They were, by professional training and personal instinct, people who had learned to process surprising things without letting the surprise show on their faces, until they had decided what showing it would cost them. That is the particular social discipline of rooms where power is real, and where the management of reaction is itself a form of power. Which is precisely why the immediate response to what Meghan had just said was so telling, because it broke that discipline. Not universally, not completely, but enough. Enough that sources who were present described the 60 seconds following the end of her disclosure as unlike anything they had witnessed in years of attending gatherings at exactly this level of the social world they all inhabited. People who were paid, in one form or another, to never look surprised ended up looking surprised. The room was divided, not along lines that a casual observer would have predicted, and not in a way that resolved itself into any simple opposition between those who supported what Meghan had said and those who were disturbed by it. It is divided along something more nuanced than that. Along the lines of what each person in that room stood to gain or lose from the information they had just been given, and how that calculus interacted with their existing relationship to the story Meghan had been telling publicly for years. A cluster of guests toward the eastern end of the main reception room, predominantly figures from the media and publishing world, had moved into what sources describe as immediate professional assessment mode. Not hostile, not sympathetic, analytical. These were people whose entire professional existence was built around the evaluation of narrative, and what they had just witnessed was, in their instinctive assessment, a narrative event of considerable significance. The questions they had been asking Meghan with careful precision earlier in the evening had just received answers that went considerably further than their most optimistic expectations. And the professional implications of that, in a world where the Sussex story remained one of the most commercially valuable narratives in global media, were being calculated in real time behind expressions of careful social neutrality. A second group, smaller and positioned closer to Meghan within the room's social geography, responded with what sources describe as genuine personal discomfort, not because they disbelieved what she had said, because they believed it and immediately understood what the consequences of saying it in that room, among those people, without the protective framework of a formal media interview or a published memoir, would be. One guest was described by sources as a figure with close personal connections to both the American entertainment world and the broader transatlantic social circuit that links Los Angeles to London. He was observed leaving the main reception room within 4 minutes of Meghan finishing speaking. They did not return for 20 minutes. When they did, their expression had the particular quality of someone who has just had a telephone conversation that confirmed their worst social instinct about a situation they were standing in the middle of. The calls started before the cars arrived. That is the detail that sources consistently emphasize when describing the speed with which the evening's events began traveling beyond the walls of that private residence. Not the following morning. Not in the careful, considered communications that might characterize the aftermath of a genuinely private social event, where everyone present felt a mutual obligation to discretion. Before the gathering had formally concluded, before Meghan herself had left the venue, messages were being composed and sent. Calls were being made in the private corners of the residence and in the quiet of personal vehicles summoned to the address with an urgency that the evening had not, when it began, seemed likely to generate. The recipient list of those early calls and messages maps the precise geography of the social and professional world that the evening had assembled, entertainment figures calling media contacts, technology figures and transatlantic connections, and at least 2 calls, sources confirm, were placed directly to individuals with documented connections to the British establishment, whose interest in anything Meghan Markle said about her time inside the royal family was not casual or personal, but deeply, specifically institutional. Those calls reached London before midnight Pacific time, which meant they arrived in Britain in the early hours, and the people who received them, sources say, did not go back to sleep. Keep watching because of how the palace found out, and what Harry did when he understood the full scope of what his wife had disclosed is where this story reaches its most consequential point. The palace finds out, Harry's reaction, and the transatlantic fallout. The call that mattered most arrived at a private number inside the British establishment at 4:47 in the morning of March 1st, 2026. Not a palace switchboard, not a press office line that would have routed the information through the ordinary channels of royal communications management. A private number, the kind that only exists in the contacts of people whose connection to the institution is personal enough and serious enough that the ordinary architecture of royal communications has never been the primary channel through which they operate. The person who received it listened for 6 minutes without speaking, asked 2 questions, received 2 answers, and then ended the call and sat with what they had just been told for long enough that the window in the room they were sitting in had begun to lighten before they moved again. By 8 in the morning, London time, 3 senior figures with direct connections to the palace's communications and legal structure were aware of the broad shape of what had happened at the Los Angeles gathering. Not the precise words, not the specific detail of the decision Meghan had named so plainly in front of a room full of the most connected people in American cultural life, but the fact of the disclosure. The fact that Meghan had stepped outside every framework of careful narrative management she had previously operated within and had said things in a private room that had proven incapable of staying private meant that the palace was going to have to think very carefully about how to respond. The response they settled on, sources say, was the same one the palace has deployed with increasing frequency in every crisis over the preceding 12 months. Silence. Deliberate, considered, institutional silence that communicates neither confirmation nor denial, and that gives nothing to the media ecosystem that was, by the time London woke fully that morning, already beginning to pick up the signal that something significant had occurred. Harry learned what Meghan had said not from Meghan. He learned it from a member of their own inner circle, who had heard from someone present at the gathering and who understood correctly that Harry needed to know before the information reached him through any less controlled channel. The conversation between Harry and that member of the inner circle has not been described in detail by any source. What sources do describe, carefully and with the particular verbal precision of people choosing their words around something genuinely sensitive, is Harry's demeanor in the hours that followed. He was not angry in any visible or externally expressed sense. He was, according to one source, with direct knowledge of his state that day, very quiet. The kind of quiet that those who know him well recognize is not as calm as the internal processing of something that has landed with a weight he had not prepared himself to absorb. The question that the palace, Harry, and everyone who witnessed that February evening is still sitting with is the same question. Was it deliberate? Stay with us because the final chapter is where that question gets its most revealing answer. What this means for Meghan's future and the point of no return. There is a question that everyone who has followed Meghan's story since she and Harry stepped back from royal duties has been asking, in one form or another, not the surface question about titles or funding, or the specific grievances documented across interviews and memoirs and carefully managed media appearances. The deeper question, the one that sits beneath all of those things, and that the February gathering in Los Angeles brought closer to a definitive answer than anything that has come before it. Is Meghan Markle still managing her story, or has she reached the point where the story has begun managing her? The distinction matters enormously. Everything Meghan has built since leaving the royal family, the commercial ventures, the advocacy platform, the carefully constructed public identity of a woman living purposefully and authentically on her own terms. They all depended on her ability to control the narrative about herself with a precision that matched or exceeded the palace's own considerable capacity for narrative management. The moment that control slips, The moment the gap between the managed version and the private reality becomes visible to the specific audience whose belief in the managed version is commercially and culturally essential, everything built on that foundation becomes vulnerable simultaneously. The February gathering was that moment, not because what Meghan said was untrue. Sources who were present are notably consistent in their assessment that what she disclosed carried the particular quality of genuine conviction rather than strategic fabrication. But because she said it in a room she could not control, and to an audience she could not fully trust, without the protective framework of a formal media context that would have given her team the ability to manage what was recorded, what was reported, and what was ultimately received by the broader public, whose perception of her story shapes everything else. That loss of control is the point of no return that this chapter's title describes. Not a dramatic rupture, not a public confrontation, or a legal proceeding, or a formal institutional break. Something quieter and in many ways more consequential than any of those things. The moment when the gap between performance and reality becomes visible to exactly the people whose perception of that gap matters most. For the royal family, watching from across the Atlantic, the February gathering represents something specific and, in institutional terms, almost satisfying in its clarity. Meghan has, in a single unguarded evening, provided the most compelling evidence yet that the carefully managed distance the palace has maintained from the Sussex narrative is the correct strategic position. You do not need to engage with a story that is dismantling itself. For Harry, the implications are more personal and more painful than any institutional calculus can capture. For Meghan herself, the question is whether the February gathering represents a moment of genuine liberation, finally saying what she has always needed to say, or the moment she looks back on as the night the carefully constructed architecture of her California reinvention developed a crack that nothing she builds subsequently will fully repair. That question does not yet have a definitive answer, but the people who were in that room believe they already know which way it is leaning.